Great hearing from everyone so far. Really enjoying the discussions today. My name's Gina. I'm a PhD student in counseling psychology at McGill, and I'm so excited to be here to introduce Dave, DOYEN. So I've crossed paths with Dave at a few past events and always really enjoyed listening to what he has to say about these topics. How he provides a nuanced viewpoint, which is something very much needed when we're talking about sensitive subjects like race and EDI. A kind reminder, if you have questions during or after the discussion, please just type them in the Q&A and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. And since this is our final talk today, I want to remind you to stick around after the Q&A discussion. We'll be having some closing remarks from Dr. Martin Drapeau. And remember to join us tomorrow for our dialogue at 10 a.m. between two scholars who have opposing views on the topic of EDI and racial ideologies. So Dave DOYEN is a diversity and inclusion consultant. His community service has been focused on advancing positive systems change to end anti-Black racism in key areas such as policing, healthcare, and child welfare. He was a member of Toronto Police Service's inaugural and second Police and Community Engagement Review Advisory Committee, which advised the service on measures to end systemic racism and improve public police relations. He was a member of the board of directors of Black Health Alliance and a Children's Aid Society of Toronto's Community Advisory Committee to reduce the overrepresentation of Black children and youth in care. So he's also a member of the Michael Jean Foundation's Board of Directors and chairs its Youth Advisory Committee. So thank you again so much for joining us, Dave, and take it away.
Merci beaucoup, Gina. Thank you very much. And good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who are probably trying to figure out my last name, if you're French, you can say Doyen. If you speak English, Doyen is good. Let me get my slides up now. Okay, Gina or Andy, can you confirm that you can see the screen? We're good to go?
Yes.
Yeah, all good. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Merci beaucoup tout le monde. Mes diapositives sont disponibles en français aussi. Alors, vous pouvez me suivre en français si vous désirez. So for those of you who are French speaking, some of the slides are available in French, so you'll be able to follow along. For those of you who are English speaking, you may want to switch to the option that allows you to listen in English, because I think the default is set to the natural language as I would present here. But I want to make sure I can reach everyone as much as I can. I'm also practicing my French, even though I'm at the intermediate level. So there are a few things I'll cover in today's presentation, which was a little bit tough to pick up. And I thank Andy for helping me frame the topic for this. So you'll get a sense of what DEI was in terms of its roots, its origin, how the field, pardon me, seems to be shifting, some of the current reactions or responses to DEI today, and what I think we could do to possibly reform this field, if you believe reform is possible. I know Dr. Haskell, who was speaking today, pretty much said, get rid of either DEI completely or training completely. But I would say that is certainly one extreme measure. It's certainly open to you, depending on what your views are, if you believe that. But I think we also need to give consideration to the consequences of a total abandonment of this field. So I'm going to start here. So opening with the history and the evolution of the field. As you'll see in this picture, it's an image of the March on Washington in the 1960s in the United States. This was, of course, part of the civil rights movement in the US. Et alors, en conséquence de le mouvement des droits civiques, le Congrès aux États-Unis a adopté le droit, pardonnez-moi, la loi sur les droits civiques. Par exemple, ici, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the US Congress, brought in equal employment opportunities, so protections for persons based on various prohibited grounds, la race de la personne, la couleur, la religion, le sexe ou l'origine nationale. So a few protected grounds there against which discrimination was not allowed. Title VII is focused on employment only, but there are several other titles, if you will, other sections of the bill. So Title I, gave voting opportunities to everyone. It also addressed discrimination that would be possible in other spheres of life, for example, public services and having accommodations and the like. So this is really where the field of diversity and inclusion was really birthed. It's out of the civil rights movement, particularly around this idea of equal employment opportunities, because many Black persons were facing discrimination in that regard. If you follow US history, right, so there was 400 years of enslavement, if you will, or 400 years of enslavement pretty much across the world. But after enslavement, you would have, the abolition of slavery in the 1860s, but it would take up to 100 years. So now we come to the 1960s when the US would say, okay, Black people aren't just property, they're actually people. But simply having citizenship did not make them full citizens in the life of the US. So it was not until the 1960s now where they actually had rights or protections against simply being Black, if you will, or African American. In the case of Canada, as you see here, maybe the first time we would have a human rights protection was in Quebec in 1975, when the l'Assemblée nationale, as it is now known, would adopt la Charte des droits et de liberté de la personne. And I've chosen two sections here to share with you, and these are specific to the domain of employment. So section 18.1 of the Charter says, you can't be asking for specific information unless it would be useful to the application to implement, let's say, affirmative action programs. And then section 20 is what would, let's say, allow for or what you may consider permissible discrimination. So as you see here, it says a distinction, exclusion, or preference based on the aptitudes or qualifications required for an employment or justified by the charitable, philanthropic, religious, political, or educational nature of a non-profit institution or of an institution devoted exclusively to the well-being of an ethnic group is deemed non-discriminatory. And you'll sometimes see similar language in other human rights legislation, for example, Nova Scotia's, and you'll even see it in our charter of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I want to share with you something that I think is important to note. So one of the well-known cases you'll learn if any of you go to law school is this case called Christie v. York. It dealt with a Black gentleman who was actually Jamaican like me, but way back when, he went into a tavern in Montreal and was ordering a drink, but he was denied service on the basis of being Black. So he brought a case before the courts and tried it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And sadly, at that time, it wasn't decided in his favor. So remember, you have to contextualize this. This is, as you see in the date of the case, this was the 1940s. So human rights protections did not exist. So the deciding factor for the court was this. The general principle of the law of Quebec is that of complete freedom of commerce. Any merchant is free to deal as he may choose with any individual member of the public. It is not a question of motives or reasons for deciding to deal or not to deal. He's free to do either. The only restriction to this general principle would be the existence of a specific law, or in the carrying out of the principle, the adoption of a rule contrary to good morals or public order. The jurisprudence pretty much says, discrimination is allowable unless there is some other law that would limit that discrimination. So that is why we now have human rights legislation. Otherwise, as you see here, a business was free to do as they so chose. Moving forward, so in the 1980s, so specifically 1985, le Parlement du Canada a adopté la loi canadienne sur les droits de la personne en vertu de la section.
Oh, hey, Dave.
Oui.
Just the interpreter was saying that maybe one language might be better for him.
Oh, okay. I'll just use the English for the interpreter. Okay, so
Thanks.
Section 7 for the Canadian Human Rights Act says it's a discriminatory practice directly or indirectly to refuse to employ or continue to employ an individual. So you see here in Canada now at the federal level, we brought in human rights protection, and employment is one domain in which we would limit or limit discrimination. And given our confederation, if you will, so, work employment is something that needs to be governed both federally and provincially. So the Canadian Human Rights Act is federal, and the various provinces and territories have their own human rights legislation. And then later we'd have the Employment Equity Act, which was the result of the Commission on Equality in Employment that was led by Rosalie Silberman-Abella, who would later become a judge of the Supreme Court. And it has two goals. One is to achieve equality in the workplace so that no person shall be denied employment opportunities or benefits for reasons unrelated to ability. And the other goal was to correct the conditions of disadvantage in employment experienced by women, Aboriginal peoples, persons with disabilities, and members of visible minorities. And the Act goes on in Section 5 to talk about the duties that an employer would have. So taking steps to identify and eliminate employment barriers against persons in designated groups and instituting such positive policies and practices that would make for reasonable accommodations for persons in those designated groups. And then by the certainly we have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms now in place by 1982. So this would precede the Employment Equity Act, but it still gives it some force. So this is what Dr. Haskell was alluding to, Section 15.2 of the Charter, which says, subsection 1 does not preclude any law, program, or activity that has as its object the amelioration or conditions of disadvantaged individuals or groups, including those that are disadvantaged because of race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability. So in our various human rights statutes, we do make allowances for what we would consider ameliorative or remedial programs. And they're not considered to offend the law or human rights legislation. Now, here's where we probably start to get into the meat of it. So I wanted you to have a sense of the legislative framework of how it is we've adopted DEI in Canada, if you will, or some of the protections that are there for it legislatively. When we now get to the practical concerns or some of the challenges that we have with this field, and I will concede to you and to anyone, it is no science and it is not perfect by any means in its implementation. So I tried to do a summary of the issues, if you will, as you see here. So we have an issue with problem definition. And by that, I mean the theory of change as just one such issue. So today, in contemporary terms, we'll talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI for short. Some places will get so bogged down in which term appears first. For example, some will say, well, we want to do inclusion and diversity. So they think it matters if they put the inclusion first. We won't get bogged down in that level of semantics. But what is important is to come to some consensus about what theory of change is driving the work that we want to do. So in the olden days, for example, there was affirmative action. Then in the US, you had employment. In the US, they use equal employment opportunity. Here in Canada, federally, as you saw in the Act, we use employment equity. Multiculturalism would become another concept. DEI and its acronym continues to expand. Some places have adopted belonging. Places talk about justice, decolonization, liberation, anti-oppression, and anti-racism. And the list could go on and on. There's accessibility, there's human rights, all of which are separate and different things, but are treated as one. So we haven't yet come to a consensus about what it is that we're using to underscore or critically reflect on what our goals are in terms of the sphere in which DEI should have influence or reach. So it used to be that DEI, as I said, was about employment, but it's now touching many spheres of life, education and healthcare. So it's almost as broad as human rights itself. And human rights, as you saw, are very specific. And there are also specific grounds that are protected. So DEI, for example, could be much broader in its grounds. DEI may say, we shouldn't discriminate against people because of their size. So we'll talk about fat phobia and sizeism. But in no human rights legislation in Canada is someone's size protected. That isn't yet a prohibited ground of discrimination. So DEI can certainly be further reaching than where human rights legislation would contemplate. When we talk about the specific communities that may be in focus, we haven't yet agreed on the terms. And language is fluid. Language is meant to evolve, right? So as you see in the Employment Equity Act, we'll talk about designated groups. Language has been thrown on, such as historically disadvantaged. There used to be equity seeking. Professor Wisdom Teti, who I think, if I remember correctly, just got appointed as the president for one of the universities elsewhere in Ontario, said we should shift from equity seeking to talk about equity deserving groups. So we need to even agree on nomenclature. Is visible minorities still acceptable language? Lots of people throw about people of color and racialized communities. What is acceptable and what is not? And even if you break down those groups, you'll find different terminologies. So for example, with the Black community, not many persons will choose to identify as Black. They may prefer to be African. They may prefer their particular country of origin. For example, I'm Jamaican. Another person may say, I'm simply Somali or I'm Sudanese. Would it be appropriate to say they're persons of African descent? Right? So language, again, can vary. Metrics, how exactly do we measure the success that we are or not having with DEI? Very often people simply look at underrepresentation as the benchmark, but how they're even defining underrepresentation is an issue. So they'll go, okay, 2% of our workforce is Black, but we have 8% of Toronto's population being Black. And I would disagree that the representation of Black folks in the population is what we should actually use to measure, because I would assume that everyone is qualified to do that job. What we need to measure against is the share of the population of those persons who are qualified to do that job. So people misunderstand exactly what is even meant by underrepresentation and how you'd go about measuring it. There is no agreement as to how someone gets qualified as a diversity and inclusion expert. What you often find is it's people who may have had lived experience, and by lived experiences, I may mean, or people may mean, they have membership in a particular group. For example, I would present as Black, someone is a woman, or they're a disabled person. So for sure they're qualified. Maybe they've done critical disability studies, or they studied human rights and the like. They've also just had passion about this thing. But those qualities or those skills totally ignore some of the other hard skills that are necessary to do this work effectively. Having an appreciation for pedagogy, how you do adult learning, adult education is a critical piece of this. Having a basis in project management, because you need to prioritize. The issues that get addressed by this field are many. And what you can end up with is just overbreadth, which will lead into diversity fatigue. And so you'll find minimal progress is being made because you're trying to boil the ocean. But then there is also this critical question of, well, why focus on the Black people and not Indigenous peoples? Why focus on those two groups and not all racialized peoples? Then what about the persons who are disabled? What about women, right? And then what happens when all of these various factors and characteristics even intersect? What is going to be done for them? So you could end up with some degree of characteristic paralysis. Last but not least, how are we addressing conflict? And conflict has emerged in different ways. If we think about some of the contemporary issues that we're facing, statues or the names of places, who we decide to commemorate, who is celebrated and who is not. So Toronto Metropolitan University, where I'm at right now, used to be Ryerson University. There was a proposal to rename Dundas Street. Now there are questions as to whether or not, we should really do that. What is the full and complete history of Mr. Dundas? So have we gotten to some consensus about that? If we got rid of statues, if we rename places, is that necessarily equal to, or is it tantamount to historical erasure? Are we trying to rewrite history when we probably want to simply expand or expound on the history? This issue of who can say a particular word, the N-word often comes up. Is it a word that is exclusive to the Black community? What happens when it's in a song? If you aren't Black and you're singing the song, is that the point at which you bleep/blurt out yourself, or are you allowed to sing the song because it's in context? Can the N-word be used in the classroom because you're probably quoting literature or reciting text, is it acceptable there? Or if you're not Black, you can't use the word at all. And people may think, you know, there is some definitive answer where that is concerned, and that would be far from the truth. Not even in the Black community is there, you know, full consensus about how we treat this word. There'll be those who say, you know what, it has deeply racist roots, we should move on from it. There'll be those who say, only those of us who are Black can use it. And there are those who talk about, well, use it in context. We've reclaimed it. You know, it's now ours. It's a shift in power dynamics, so it's okay. But again, there's no consensus here. So what are some of the current responses or reactions that we're seeing to DEI, this backlash, if you will, that is happening? What you find now is in the business world, some places are worried about the dynamics or the influence it's having on interpersonal relations between team members. So Coinbase may have been one of the first companies. It's a tech company to say, you know, they've been summarized as banning political discussion. So in a message from their CEO, Brian Armstrong, and these are just excerpts of his message that I'm sharing with you. He said, you know, the reason is that while I think these efforts are well-intentioned, they have the potential to destroy a lot of value at most companies, both by being a distraction and by creating internal division. And as you see here, he said, you know, they apparently had a staff meeting on whatever internal communications and exchanges would have had with employees. And he said, here's our clear agreement going forward. We won't debate causes or political candidates internally that are unrelated to work. We won't expect the company to represent our personal beliefs externally. We won't assume negative intent or not have each other's back. And we won't take on activism outside of our core mission at work. So companies are trying to get very, very specific about their purpose and the role they'll play, the corporate purpose that they have. At Shopify, Toby Lutke also did the same thing, raising concerns about what Shopify is and what Shopify is not. Shopify is also not the government. We cannot solve every societal problem here. We're part of an ecosystem of economies, of culture, and of actual countries. We also can't take care of all your needs. We'll try our best to take care of all the ones that ensure you can support our mission. Shopify's worldview is well documented. We believe in liberal values and equality of opportunity. But to close it out, beyond straight performance output, everyone that engages in endless Slack trolling, victimhood thinking, us versus them, divisiveness, and zero-sum thinking must be seen for the same threat that they are. They break teams. Teams survive and thrive on the actions of the collective and the cohesiveness of the whole. Poor performance and divisiveness cannot be tolerated. And Google, as you may have seen in the news, several employees there were protesting, you know, possibly selling artificial intelligence technology to Israel. So they had occupied some of Google's offices in protest of that. So Sundar Pichai, their CEO, you know, shared a statement that, again, this is just an excerpt. And he said, but ultimately we are a workplace and our policies and expectations are clear. This is a business and not a place to act in a way that disrupts coworkers or makes them feel unsafe. To attempt to use the company as a personal platform or to fight over disruptive issues or debate politics. This is too important a moment as a company for us to be distracted. Beyond that, beyond companies clarifying their missions, you may have also seen reactions here by our own people. So, for example, there was the 1 million march. So how it is that, and, you know, calling for the various governments to protect parents' rights, particularly around this issue, this now protected ground of discrimination called gender identity and gender expression. So in Nova Scotia, Policy 713, and Nova Scotia was the first jurisdiction to take action on this where parents' rights are concerned and how students may choose to identify with respect to gender pronouns. Implementing this policy that would require parents be informed, right? Making sure parents can have a role to play. But these things will now need to be, you know, protecting parents' rights will also need to be balanced with protecting the rights of the child. And as you see now before the courts is Saskatchewan's legislation, and they've invoked the notwithstanding clause there, and Alberta has joined them in that action. So it'll be interesting to see what the courts will rule going forward, because what Saskatchewan did was also enact the Education Amendment Act that you can refer to as the Parents' Bill of Rights. So as it says here, subject to the other provisions of this act and to the regulations, a parent or guardian of a pupil has the right to, if sexual health content is to be presented to pupils in the school at least 2 weeks before the sexual health content is presented to the pupils, that they be informed by the principal of the subject matter of the sexual health content, the dates on which that content is going to be taught, and the like. And Alberta, and another part of Saskatchewan's bill is that there be consent for change to gender identity. Alberta hasn't yet brought forward legislation, but the Premier had released a video in which he outlined some of the measures that they would be putting in place, and this came from a motion that was adopted by at their party's convention. So for example, for minors 17 and under, top and bottom gender reassignment surgeries would not be permitted. For children 15 and under, puberty blockers and hormone therapy for the purpose of gender reassignment or affirmation is not permitted, except for those who have already started those treatments. So again, pardon me, across the country, various provinces, various jurisdictions are taking action to balance the rights, if you will, or find happy medium to give parents, to respect the role of parents, but also respecting the rights of the child. Based on a survey, I think just maybe a little after Nova Scotia had implemented their policy, 57% of Canadians think when a student in a public school tells a teacher or another school official that they want to change their gender or have a new gender pronoun, schools should let the child's parents know. So the majority of respondents think parents should be informed. And you can see a breakdown by other demographics, by age or region and gender, and whether or not people have children in their household, how they responded to the survey. But generally, there's broad support for that policy. In another survey too, that was done by by Angus Reid, you also see the majority of Canadians preferring a policy where parents must be informed and give consent for the change, in contrast to two other measures where parents should only be informed or where parents are neither informed. And if you slice it by someone's political ideologies, if you will, you find broader support if someone may identify as a member of the CPC, the Conservative Party of Canada, but you see decreasing support maybe as you go towards the left of the political spectrum. It's interesting, in the Bloc Québécois, you find a little, more variation there. As we're seeing in the US, so several states also bringing forward action to either ban or limit DEI. So this image, there's a DEI tracker or anti-DEI tracker, if you will, that has been prepared, and several media houses are tracking this. So you can see several states have actually begun to introduce legislation, and some have already adopted things into law. Here's a flyer, a summary flyer that was prepared by Florida, where they introduced a Stop Woke Act, and woke, or Stop Woke here means Stop the Wrongs to Our Kids and Employees Act. And three summaries. So protections for teachers and students in schools. So prohibiting the teaching or the hiring of critical race theory consultants. For corporations, it would protect employees against the hostile work environment due to critical race theory training. I'll pause here to note, a court in Florida did find that the prohibition with respect to businesses was unconstitutional because they found the language too vague. So it'll be interesting to see how Florida, if they pursue an appeal or how they may reform the legislation. And then consequences, so tools for employees and teachers to fight back. So providing employees, parents, and students a private right of action and strengthening enforcement through the Florida Department of Education. So coming now to the last bit of it, what are some possible reforms, if you will, that I think we may be able to consider? And this is not the totality of it. These are just a few. So there's a lot of disagreement about what it is that we're actually referring to and whether or not we have systemic discrimination in Canada. And the courts have taken judicial notice of this. So this systemic discrimination is something that is recognized, but what it is seems to be a definition or a term in dispute. So in the 1980s, in this case where it was the Ontario Human Rights Commission versus Simpson-Sears, the court wrote in its judgment, a distinction must be made between direct discrimination that would sometimes refer in practice to as individual discrimination or interpersonal discrimination, and then adverse effect discrimination, which you could be referred to as systemic discrimination. Direct discrimination occurs in this connection where an employer adopts a practice or rule which on its face discriminates on a prohibited ground. For example, no Catholics or no women or Blacks employed here. On the other hand, there is adverse effect discrimination. It arises where an employer for genuine business reasons adopts a rule or standard which is on its face neutral and which will apply equally to all employees, but which has a discriminatory effect upon a prohibited ground on one employee or group of employees, in that it imposes, because of some special characteristic of the employee or group, obligations, penalties, or restrictive conditions not imposed on other members of the workforce. This was also explored in other cases, but rather than go through the whole definition, what I want to point out here, in this case where it was Canadian National versus the Canadian Human Rights Commission, the court was citing former Justice Abella's report from the Commission on Equality in Employment. So she didn't offer a specific definition of systemic discrimination, but what she did do is give you these key elements of it, if you will. So in talking about systemic discrimination, she said, it's not a question of whether this discrimination is motivated by an intentional desire to obstruct someone's potential, or whether it is the accidental byproduct of innocently motivated practices or systems. If the barrier is affecting certain groups in a disproportionately negative way, it is a signal that the practices that lead to this adverse impact may be discriminatory. And this is why it is important to look at the results of a system. And we'll look at just two once I wrap up on this. And in the same case, the court just said, to combat systemic discrimination, it is essential to create a climate in which both negative practices and negative attitudes can be challenged and discouraged. So what might this look like? So in the province of Ontario, and I think this used to be in other provinces too, but still here in the province, is this practice of streaming. So this idea of streaming is putting students based on assessments, if you will, into either the essentials program, the applied program, or the academic stream. And Professor Carl James, who is at York University, he and his colleague Tana Turner published this report that analyzed Toronto District School Board data. And what you found was Black students were 3 times more likely to be put in the essentials program, almost twice more likely, and maybe in one case, 3 times more likely to be placed in the applied program. But in the academic stream, they were maybe just a little bit under half as likely to be placed in the academic stream. So this needs to be, and the impact of this is who is moving on to the university context and what students may visualize for themselves in terms of occupational pursuits based on how, their guidance counselors may put them into certain streams. And there is a whole issue around how the guidance counselors and even teachers are doing their assessments of students, particularly racialized, and in this case, more so Black students. When you also look at disciplinary measures that are being taken, you find that Black students were being suspended at disproportionate rates compared to their white and other racialized counterparts. And there is a significant body of research in the US that looks at the treatment Black students will have in the classroom. For example, I think when teachers were asked to monitor bad behavior, they were more likely to stare at Black students. And if that Black student was said to have a history of problematic behavior, it increased the likelihood of that Black student being punished more severely. And if Black students were being punished, more severe punishment was meted out to Black boys. So again, this level of analysis is important. So if we think about the streaming policies, there's nothing that said you need to treat Black students this way or that you should punish Black students more harshly than anyone else. But this is what it means by looking at these systems in terms of their effect, the ultimate result. What happens when we're seeing these disparities? And of course, there would be cause for reason to do a root cause analysis. Maybe the results are justifiable, but then we also need to examine the motivations to go, okay, what led to this? Are they actually justifiable or are they not? And this also looked at the dropout rates, and there's a lot of research there. I wanted to show you, so there's some recent research from that's done by some researchers, I think, at Harvard and U of T. They looked at this practice of resume whitening. So how racialized individuals themselves are responding to the discrimination they expect to receive in the employment/recruitment process. And they found resume whitening will take two forms. Candidates will either adjust their name or adjust their experience. So really whiten. And those whitening technique could take the form of you alter your first name or use an additional name. With respect to experience, you might omit some experiences, you might change the description of your experience, or you might add white experience. So here's what a resume could look like. Let's say the candidate is Lamar James Smith. He was a Millennium Gate Scholar. And these are really using American experiences, if you will. The National Society of Black Engineers, mind you, we have a chapter of that here in Canada. We would have Black Students Associations here in Canada and the like. So here's what this whitening process would look like. So assuming Lamar is a name that is typically Black or associated with Black persons, Lamar James Smith would get presented as L. James Smith. The Millennium Gate Scholar, if it was known to be an award that was set up for visible minorities in the US, African Americans, it may be better to remove it. And you have to consider the consequence of removing that. Having a scholarship should be an indication of scholastic aptitude. But now removing this, the employer is missing a positive indicator about you. Membership in the National Black Society of Engineers, something you may remove. Being a part of the African American business leaders, you remove that. So again, you whiten it by taking out that descriptor, and then you simply say you've been a member of the University Students Association. What you also see in effect is a reduction of the content you'd present on your resume. So much experience gets removed. And it influenced the callback rate. So what happens when a candidate does or does not whiten their experience? Looking specifically at Black students, if you didn't whiten, you had a 10% callback rate. But if you whiten both name and experience, your callback rate went up by as much as 15.5%. For Asian applicants, they also saw an 8.5% increase. And of course, you see a greater increase for persons who are Asian if they whiten their name as opposed to experience, and the inverse happens for Black folks. But again, in overall effect, if you take on both, all of them see an increase in the callback rate. And I'll say to my clients, think about winning the lotto. If I told you there are specific steps you could take to increase your chances of winning, wouldn't you do that? And that's exactly what these candidates are trying. But there's still a catch. Here's what the researchers found. And they said this was the major point in their research. You are at an even greater risk for discrimination when applying with a pro-diversity employer because you're being more transparent. So if you think about job descriptions, there's oftentimes this language that if you're a member of this particular group or have these characteristics, we encourage you to apply. So the candidates would take that as, oh, they're pro-diversity, they're diversity friendly. Let me be my whole self. So they would not amend their resumes / whiten their resumes. But then there's a consequence of not whitening the resume. So you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. And we need to grapple with the effects of discrimination. There is sufficient research that talks about both the psychological and physiological effects of discrimination that happens. Very often people talk about the business case for diversity. I don't spend my time doing that. I think it totally ignores what we're trying to prevent happening to the individuals themselves, the real harm that is there. And I know we can debate this question of what exactly should qualify as harm. But this is how people actually cope with discrimination, either through low self-esteem, a reduced sense of agency, feelings of hopelessness and helplessness, and increased drug and alcohol consumption, so increased substance use. And, you know, I'll share with you, there's a case that I helped to prepare an expert opinion on. The woman had pretty much a document this thick with respect to her psychological assessment based on the racism she had experienced in the workplace. She couldn't go back to work. She was so mentally and psychologically beaten up and destroyed. There was no way in which this woman would ever be fit to return to work, and she still has many years before her. And the lawyer came back to us and told us, you know what, it was probably the easiest settlement it was to ever get from a government. So there are real cases of what this stuff looks like. I was also in a room when Black employees met with then a minister responsible for anti-racism, Michael Coteau, and the woman shared very openly about how Black employees are disproportionately punished in the public service. And she said, this experience and treatment that she was facing destroyed her so much she contemplated suicide. And I have never heard someone openly confess to the contemplation of suicide before that. I've since had friends who, share that, not necessarily because of racism, but in this case, it was. And so we really have to be mindful of what happens to people, right? It's not just, oh, I've been discriminated against and I'm so hurt. That hurt can manifest differently for several persons. We need to rethink this idea of training. So David Haskell was raising several concerns about training, and I would say they're valid to a point. I wouldn't be of the view that you should totally abandon training. And sometimes people in communities will call for, yes, make the training mandatory. And even those calls I wouldn't support, because based on the research, which I'll show in a bit, mandatory training can do more harm than good. But there's research that tells us when we do have this kind of education, we can probably help to mitigate or address some of the biases that people may have. The concerns that are raised about are more so not about doing training, but how the training is done. So Kalev and Dobbin, who I think David Haskell also recited, but he didn't speak about this bit, was to talk about the reasons for the adverse effects. So when training is based on negative messages, for example, that we're doing DEI training, more so as a CYA measure, cover our ass measure, people interpret negative things from that. So it doesn't help with a positive approach to the training. When it is also mandatory, so if people feel they're being compelled to think a certain way, or if they didn't want to go into it, it's more so a psychological reaction. It can be adverse in effect. And if we describe managers as high groups, the managers resented being described as such, even though they have responsibility for several processes that affect the employee, for example, promotion and your salaries and the like. They didn't like being referred to as a high-risk group. So again, we have to think about how we communicate unconscious bias or the DEI training. It's not necessarily about whether the DEI training is done. And I would even add, there are also issues, as I raised earlier, issues around the expertise. Who's qualified to deliver this stuff? Because I have indeed borne witness to supposedly DEI experts who go on stage, and I'm sitting there and I'm going, oh my God, I can't believe this person said that, and they should know better. So there are people who think they know and have no business teaching, and they have unfortunately been engaged by various organizations to be their instructors. And Kalev and Dobbin in their research also talk about measures that are effective in increasing representation and measures that may not be so helpful. So as you see here, mandatory diversity training is not one that is helpful. It actually caused a reduction in the share of Black and Asian managers in the managerial class, and job tests and grievance systems actually cause more harm too. They also shared what measures may be helpful to increase representation. And you find significant success in diversity task forces, mentoring, and the like. In general, what they found was measures that help to facilitate or build relationships were actually productive, were actually positive in terms of bringing about change. And we also need to be mindful of how these strategies may even have different effects across the various groups. So to conclude, I pose to you these discussion questions. As I spoke about before with respect to challenges with implementation, what should be or what could be the theory or theories of change that we use? Do we still want to use DEI? Are there other theories that may be more helpful? If you're of the view that they should be totally abandoned, fine. But I would say to you, consider what we also just looked at. How do we actually address systemic discrimination? How do we address discrimination that may be there in broader society? Because it's one thing to go, okay, dump this as a solution, but then the calls for those who will say to you that they're on the oppressed side or the marginalized side or they're vulnerable to discrimination, what would you offer to them as a solution? What should actually fill its place? One may say, well, the courts have proven themselves capable of dealing with that, but I'd say to you, waiting on judicial guidance is also very, very limited. Not everyone has access to the courts. You can go broke trying to go to the courts. And right now we're dealing with a significant backlog of cases in the courts. So then we're going to be raising bigger questions about equity. Who can access justice? Who can afford lawyers? And you don't just want to be able to afford a lawyer, you need to afford good representation. And can you wait that long? For how long would the harm or the adverse effects last? Scope, should we come back to limiting DEI to the employment domain? Or is it fair to say it has broader applicability and we should allow for that, but we really need to think about how far-reaching this stuff should be? How might we measure its effects and its effectiveness? We'll probably find competing research about whether unconscious bias training is sufficient or not. From what I've seen, unconscious bias training really is very limited in its effect. Training in general can be limited in its effect. Training, even about any other topic, has to be supported by other systemic supports. How are things being reinforced? How are you being evaluated? And the like. How do we measure behavior changes? So it's not just, and this is where I'll agree with David to go, you do a survey with the workshop attendees at the start and a survey right after where they go, yes, I think it may change my behavior, but that's not measuring in the long term. That is very, very immediate, and there'd be some amount of recency bias there. If we're going to question expertise, so who should be qualified? Several universities and several institutions are coming up with these certifications. That one is a certified inclusion practitioner, a CIP. You could get your certificate in diversity and inclusion education. Would that be sufficient? Maybe, maybe not, right? If we have, for various professions, define qualifications, how we know someone is qualified to be a lawyer, a doctor, a nurse, the various colleges that regulate these professions. Might we need something of the sort then if we think diversity and inclusion should be a profession? And again, you may be of the view or the perspective that there is no such thing and this is a field or a fake science that should be entirely abandoned. Last but not least, how do we deal with conflict? Should we be calling out people or do we find ways to call in people? Do we create safe spaces or brave spaces? How are we going to determine whether or not we rename a space or simply add to its history so that all are well informed? Or should things be renamed? Is it how we remove ourselves from, our colonial past that is still here? And who gets celebrated and who doesn't get celebrated? And what will actually be meaningful? I'll give you as an example, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which had recommended that Parliament proclaim a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, which Parliament did. But we may question now, how helpful has that been? So I think in the original recommendation, and don't quote me too much on this, it may have been that it should have been a holiday. But then there are concerns about, okay, but maybe it's supposed to be a day of grieving. It's a day of commemorating how terribly Indigenous peoples were treated. So should this be celebratory in mood or nature? Many of us as Canadians, we don't even understand how to approach the day. So if it's a federal holiday or if it's some other statutory holiday, what does that celebration or commemoration look like? What am I supposed to do? Or is it just for Indigenous peoples? So I do believe, and I'm sure you'd agree with me, there are serious and critical questions that warrant discussion. And again, DEI is not black and white. It is incredibly vague because it's as diverse as our values, and those things do get brought into it. I can share with you, I am in some ways relieved that I'm not working in this field right now, because I really would not want to have to deal with the current conflict between Israel and Hamas. So I think one or maybe several speakers have spoken to how DEI is said to now be giving license or permission to anti-Semitism. I wouldn't go that far. I don't think that is what DEI practitioners are intending to do. I think what we are seeing is there is a serious paralysis about how to act. If you talk to anyone who will really critically reflect on the present conflict, there is no winning side to this. And so if you issue a statement that, would be drafted by someone who works on the DEI team, it would be okay. Yes, we're going to acknowledge how terrible October 7 was for the Israelis, right? 1,200 plus persons lost their lives. Several persons are kidnapped, and Jews and Israelis are grieving, and that warrants some recognition. Absolutely. We're going to get people are probably going to go, well, what about the occupation in Palestine? What about the many thousands of Palestinians who have lost their lives? What about Islamophobia in society? How are you being quiet as an organization? And then you may go, okay, as a DI person, I need to draft a statement that is speaking to all these conflicts. And then both may even come back to you saying, no, you should not be addressing my issue with their issue. This just happened, so only talk about what happened on October 7th. Or guess what? Now that Israel is taking action, only talk about the loss of lives in Palestine. Is this or is this not a genocide? A question that was put before the International Court of Justice, not entirely resolved. But again, it's very difficult, and people are asking DEI practitioners to take black and white responses, which they sometimes do, to questions that are themselves not so black and white, because this thing is not black and white. So I leave you with that. I hope this has been helpful for you. I know I probably just raised more questions than I've given you answers, but that is the point and the very purpose of this. It's far from black and white. I am now open to your questions and your comments.
Thank you so much, Dave. Wonderful presentation. And we've got a few questions lined up for you. So thanks again. That was very interesting. First question, what do you make of the idea that only people of the relevant group are allowed to have an opinion or take a position on the subject? For example, should white people be allowed to have an opinion on whether it is appropriate in certain contexts to use the N-word, or when quoting directly from a text in an educational context?
I want to run away from having my personal opinions on this stuff because, this is just asking me to be stoned depending on where you sit on this issue. Listen, legally, and maybe this is where I give myself a carve out. Legally, your Section 2B rights for freedom of expression probably give you some license there. I think it's hard to say. I think everything needs to be put in context. Sometimes when people are using these words, you have to question, okay, what is the purpose for using it? So regardless of whether one is black or not, I'd question, is there a need to use the word and use the word as is? What exactly prevents a person from using the N-word, the bleeped out version per se? Maybe it is to communicate the gravity of the situation. So fine. So maybe put into context. But again, I'm only one perspective on this issue. The NAACP in the US, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, they had actually done a funeral to bury the N-word, a makeshift mock funeral, if you will, to bury the N-word, because it comes from a period in which it was only meant to be used in a derogatory sense. And for those who grew up during that time, pre and probably during the civil rights movement, they will have their own responses to this word. I've been born post the civil rights movement, and I can tell you, I don't use the term. I find no reason to use it. I don't think it's necessary, but neither am I going to go out there and tell another black person or anyone for that matter that they can't. For me, I grapple with this. We have so many rappers who will use it in their songs, and they'll go, and it's just, how do you look at the white person, the brown person, the red person, the yellow person, and go, that was the part you're supposed to bleep out? You're probably spitting lyrics like everybody else in the show, in the concert, and you probably even did it totally unconsciously. So how do I hold you accountable and accuse you for that? And how do you even measure intent? You're just singing the words of the song. There is, at my law school, there was a recent incident in which a judge who was a scholar in residence there was saying the name of a gang. I think she may have even been reading from court transcript or just citing the name of the gang, and it involved the N-word. And because she used it, people complained. What is interesting is that the complaint was not triggered by Black students, but others who, thought they need to express solidarity for Black students. So you even have that as an issue, right? The extent of allyship and the boundaries of allyship. And sadly, it's resulted in, that judge now not being a scholar at the school anymore. And we've also seen it in the news where persons have been punished otherwise in their jobs, lots of backlash. I think at University of Ottawa, there was such an incident and the like. It's hard to say how these things are going to go down. Maybe the safest bit is to just avoid it. I would offer that as a protective stance for those who are not Black, because I wouldn't want anyone to stone you or you risk losing your job or just being branded as racist. But I do think we need to give some space to context. What is the context in which the person using it? And I'd also challenge anyone, Black or white, or whatever their identifiers may be. If you're going to use it, is it actually necessary? Right? Because we now have so many words and ways in which refer to Black people. Do you actually need that one?
Wonderful. Thank you for that answer. Okay, next up in line, we have a guest who asks, some critics of standard DEI distinguish between eliminating discrimination and minimizing it. The idea here is that while discrimination still exists in Canada, given the inherent flaws in human nature, the level of discrimination is now getting close to minimal. Also, every policy change has trade-offs. For example, it has negative as well as positive effects. So in that case, further efforts in this area are likely to have a net gain that is near zero. What do you think about this viewpoint?
I thought I heard this best expressed once when I went to a conference in the US by Reverend Jesse James. And he was at a tech conference. He was talking about the underrepresentation of Black folks in tech. He was talking about a meeting they had with members of Congress. And he said, and a similar question was proposed, that it's so hard to effect change through DEI. What's the point of trying? And he said he would rather try, and I can't quote it because it's been a while, but I have it written down somewhere. But what he pretty much said was he would rather go down trying, knowing that there were footprints on the door trying to break it down than to have just totally accepted the situation. And I would share his response. Yes, I believe human nature is indeed so flawed. In Jamaica, we have an expression, to put it in English, we would say the donkey says the world is not level. And Jamaicans are borrowing from, if you look at how a donkey walks, right, it's up and down. So yes, injustice, fairness, partiality will probably remain a defect of our lives, our entire existence. But I don't think we should fail to try to mitigate and prevent harms wherever possible. For example, just because you live in a safe neighborhood, I don't think you take for granted that you don't just push up your door, but you turn the knob. You keep it locked, and you may in fact install an alarm system, right, to make yourself safer. You take as many measures as you can. It doesn't mean, as we're seeing right now, as if thieves are going to be prohibited by that, but we still take protective measures where possible. And again, I think that response, there's merit to it in that, yes, what's the point of chasing a target that keeps on moving? But that also needs to be balanced with, as I showed you, the real effects, the impact on people who are affected by discrimination. They actually need some recourse. They actually need some remedial measures to provide them assistance.
Thank you. I think your response goes well into this next question also, which begins by thanking you for this presentation that you've given. The question has to do with the dismissal of expertise that we see in public discourse and how we counter this. So for example, anthropogenic, so human-caused climate change is a fact. There's ample scientific evidence to substantiate this, yet some politicians and academics would argue that this evidence is illegitimate because it's part of the radical left or the establishment and therefore can't be trusted. We see time and time again the dismissal of expertise, for example, that systemic discrimination exists and leads to negative outcomes for equity-deserving groups. How then can we even have conversations on these topics when scholarly sources rooted in EDI or social justice are waved away and disregarded as irrelevant?
I think what is happening is not even something that is tied to DEI per se, or even whatever the sphere may be. I think we're just in a period where people have become deeply polarized. We're only open to the ideas and perspectives that support or reinforce our current ways of thinking. So it's hard to be open to information that would challenge you in any way. I think in some ways we're also dealing with the effect of the boy who cried wolf. So if you hear people keep on crying out, oh, this, and I will certainly hold people from the oppressed and the marginalized and the other marginalized communities accountable here. When people easily point to something else, yes, that is anti-Black racism, or they're being ableist, you begin to minimize and discredit when discriminatory incidents actually take place. So very often, those of us who, for example, are steeped in community work will go, no, that is not an incident of discrimination. That is absolutely not what that is. And you need to hold yourself accountable. But people will find that, it's so easy for them to make hay to go, I was discriminated against. It was racist, it was homophobic, and all the like. And it takes away from when these incidents do happen and you want people's attention to go, no, this is a real case of discrimination. We actually need to do something about it. So people are right now just only open to, and sadly so, what speaks to them or what resonates with them. And we'll need to figure out how we create environments where dissent is appreciated, where dissent is welcomed, where differing perspectives are welcomed. And that needs to happen all across the spectrum of political ideologies. There are right-wing folks who will only want to listen to themselves. Centrist folks only want to listen to themselves. And left-wing folks who only want to listen to themselves. But however you're listening to yourselves, what you've done is also the antithesis of diversity, which is you're putting yourself in an echo chamber, and that isn't helpful. You need to be challenged. You need to be open to different ways of thinking. You need to be open to new information, to update your current positions. In law, one of the things I think lawyers learn to appreciate with court judgments is when the court isn't unanimous, there will be a dissenting opinion. And they don't walk away from each other as though their colleagues are somehow any less than. You may very well like the decision in the majority and you go, I see that, I get that thinking from the judges. And then you may read the dissent and go, ooh, that's actually clear and solid thinking as well. And you may be torn both ways going, so which one should actually prevail? And it just happens to be the majority. And as you see with courts, today, this decision prevails, it could be overturned the next day, right? It depends on who's there. I was reading a recent article from Jamaica by a former judge, and I think he was quoting a former judge in the US that says, the Supreme Courts aren't infallible because they're final. They aren't final because they're infallible. They're infallible because they're final. Right? Once you get to the Supreme Court, that's your last level of appeal. If there's another one, you could challenge that too. And we saw that happen in Dobbs v. Jackson, where this, a lot of people go, see, they were taking away people's right to an abortion. And you go, is that actually what the decision said? That is not what Dobbs v. Jackson decided. It decided whether or not, what level, what order of government in the US was right to determine whether or not you could have restrictions on abortion. And by overturning Roe v. Wade, it said this decision is to rest with the states as opposed to Congress federally. So it is up to the various states to decide how they'll want to proceed on this issue. And it's also open to the US Congress to go, you know, we're going to overrule the court in that respect. In Canada, we have a very different constitutional and legal framework. So how we deal with overturning things or addressing things that are constitutional will be a little bit more difficult.
Great, thank you. Next, someone was wondering how you feel about being the first person to use the term systemic discrimination today.
Feel no way about it. There's no way to feel about it. Listen, I live for these conversations. I have found it very valuable to be a member of the Heterodox Academy. I remember I stumbled into this thing a few years ago at one of the conferences, and I'm probably the lone wolf here as somewhat not necessarily being pro DEI or anti DEI. It's just, let's have a conversation about this thing. Because I can recognize and appreciate it is not perfect and pure as physics or biology and as clear-cut as those things may be. Or, however one may want to debate the place of the social sciences. Let's always be open to a discussion, respectful dialogue, necessary dialogue. I was going to share in my slides what the courts here in Canada have recognized or have acknowledged as the rationales for the purpose of freedom of expression. And there are three. One is about self-fulfillment. The other is about public participation in the democratic and social life of your country. And the third, and it's not necessarily in that order, but the third has to do with the pursuit of truth. The pursuit of truth. So yes, raise systemic discrimination. Let's debate it. Let's discuss it. As we saw during the activism that followed the death of George Floyd, what people call the Black Lives Matter movement, if you were discussing issues of racism or systemic racism in Quebec, the response from government was that we have no systemic racism in Quebec, right? And we know Quebec can be Quebec. Just a very different way of thinking for various reasons. But let's have that discussion. Let's debate it. Let's actually look at what the research says. And as Justice Abella pointed out in the report that the courts have adopted, let's look at the results. What happens is people conflate different kinds of discrimination. So you have intrapersonal, so that's just with the self. There's the interpersonal, where that's between people. There can be the institutional, the organizational, how an organization may set up itself. And then may be the institutional, which is referring to the systemic and adverse impact discrimination. So we need to know which one we're talking about. I believe the focus of DEI should be on the systemic issues, because in reality, as one of the questions was even alluding to, I can't govern or dictate or force someone to change their behavior within the hours of 9 to 5 and while they're within the spheres of work. What will constrain them is the code of conduct and other employment policies and the like, but their beliefs and their other values, they're still open to having, and they have every right to have them as is protected by law and just on, basic moral grounds. But what I can control is how processes are developed, how policies are drafted, and monitor and measure the impact of those. And by doing that, if you think about environment shaping behavior, if we create the right environment, we can help to shape behavior.
Thanks. That actually brings me to a question I had for you about, you had spoken about being a consultant and the training or lack of training. So I wondered, do you believe that being a diversity and inclusion consultant should be regulated or standardized somehow? And what are some of the risks of the variability in qualifications?
I would say, if we begin to regulate it or recognize it as a profession, then a fair conclusion is then we're pretty much saying, yes, it's okay to have DEI. So what happens if you're from a camp that says, get rid of this stuff completely, then you wouldn't be entertaining a discussion about whether or not the profession should be regulated and how you determine certifications or qualifications. It's going to be hard to say. There's a profit motive to this, as people are pointing out. It's a $1 billion industry. Different post-secondary institutions and not-for-profit organizations are developing qualifications. There's money to be made from this, but it's also in response to organizations, pardon me, trying to protect themselves or be better. So there's a market need, so just finding a response to a market need. But as you're seeing in the US, you could certainly take steps to regulate it, to prevent it, to ban, or otherwise limit. But what should become of it? I mean, I think we're still in a state and a place of we need to still talk about this. Before DEI became a big thing, because of the Employment Equity Act, it's what created a class of jobs that was specific to employment equity. If you were in a federally regulated workplace or you were under federal jurisdiction, that work had to be done. Of course, it was forked out to human resources personnel, but sometimes they may have actually carved out a specific thing for persons working in employment equity. And again, employment equity is narrower than even DEI. So hard to say. Again, one of the black and white things. I want to quickly address this question that I saw pop up, because this person is asking this question of choosing different words. How is this different from censoring speech? If one is directly quoting from a record in an educational or historic context, how can one argue for using a different word? Again, I think that's such a binary argument. I don't like that. This idea of censoring, I don't think I want to go that far to say that it's censoring. Again, I point to being able to use things in context. So if the person is fine that it is appropriate to the context to use the word, I didn't say they can't use the word. Does it befit the context? But then I'd also ask them to use their motivation. Is it necessary to use it? Could you use another word per se? But if you do believe, right, after you've done your cost-benefit analysis, that it may add to the gravity to use that word, or it makes your example clearer and you think it's appropriate in the context, go. But it is not, oh, just because you're going to use a different word, you're immediately self-censoring. I disagree with the premise in the question.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm going to bring us back to the question right before that. How much weight should be given to the idea that EDI policies in the workplace will cause doubt amongst employees? So if one was hired in accordance to equitable hiring policies, does this not create doubt that this individual was hired based on their merit? It appears that these hiring policies can have counterproductive consequences.
I would say that's fair. And I mean, you know what people also, what critics sometimes ignore and fail to account for is if you're a member of any of these groups that DEI is targeting, no one is hoping they were hired because of any one of the protected or unprotected characteristics. You are hoping you weren't hired just because you were fat and you're in an organization that is tackling fat phobia and sizeism. You would hope that you weren't hired as a doctor just because you were Black. My dear friend and colleague or former Governor General Michael Jean, shared with a group when she was announced as Governor General, and the press conference was done, I think, after Prime Minister Paul Martin had spoken and said, she'd be presented as our next Governor General. They were walking away, and she said she heard a reporter say, "How does it feel to be the token person?" And she said they kept on walking, but she just stopped. And she turned around to go back to the mic and she said, "I am nobody's token." But imagine these critics, even the media, right? And depending on where now you sit on the left or right, you may have various views about the media. But look at the premise in that question to immediately diminish or minimize Michael Jean. On what basis would one offer her as a token? What exactly drives that question? She's not coming into it wanting to be a token. I'm sure our current Governor General, Madam Mary Simon, is not hoping she was there simply because she's Indigenous. One may argue, yes, the current situation in Canada after the discovery of the unmarked graves, and yes, there's a question out there as to whether these are just anomalies, they could be whatever. For sure, she may not even just want to be there simply because she's Inuit. It's, what is my record? No doctor, no Black, Indigenous, brown, otherwise disabled or whatever the case may be, doctor is going to want to have any patient question them to say, oh, did you come through some specialized program? Are you a pilot flying this plane and you actually don't know how to land it if an emergency should happen? No, that is not the case. I can tell you at the University of Toronto, where we have the Black students admissions process, and I was part of the consultations. To do that, I was also part of a follow-up advisory committee. So, people did raise concerns. Well, are we going to lower the MCAT scores or the GPA requirements for them by creating this Black students admissions process? And the answer was no. The MCAT requirement stayed the same. The GPA requirement stayed the same. All the other components in the application stayed the same. If a student elected to be part of the Black students admissions process, they actually had more work to do. They had an extra essay to write. And the only thing that was also different is that application would be viewed by a panel of Black persons, so people from the community, Black medical experts, and the like. But the rest of the admissions process to get into U of T's med school was still the same. They'd have to participate in what we'd call the multi-station interviews and the like. But the minimum entry point, so basic MCAT score, basic GPA, writing the necessary essays, that never changed. It did not go away. So no person is hoping they're just there because of the characteristic of their skin, because they're also preparing for that backlash, that you would look at them and go, that's that person that came through the process. So they may not be as smart as. But we'd have to question this idea of merit. I have to spend some time on this, actually.
Yeah.
If in another conference or presentation, I could walk you through the talent acquisition process in detail about how flawed it is, and we would need to question this notion of meritocracy. From the preparation of the job description, the very words that constitute the job description, to where it's promoted, to who is targeted, how referrals are made, how we actually screen, as I showed you in that resume process, how the candidates may even present themselves, how we decide to evaluate at that screening point, how we decide to structure the interview, how we decide to evaluate the responses in the interview, how the questions are posed in the interview, and how we actually come to decide the candidate. It is riddled and flawed with biases. So if you've been hired just because there was no process that labeled this is entirely for a specific group or community, there's still nothing to tell me that your process was 100% meritocratic. It could indeed be questioned whether or not a process was targeted. And that's why I've even said to my clients, if you can walk me through a process and you still end up with a team of all white men, good. But if we're going to walk through that process and there was a flaw there that was glaring, we may have an issue to address.
Great, thank you so much. I'm seeing the time. We do have kind of one question left. Would you like to address this one quickly?
Go for it, go for it.
We'll just,
I want people to feel satisfied.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, great talk, fully. Thank you for such a thoughtful presentation, this guest has said, and one delivered with care. Institutionalizing EDI is in its early stages with many hiccups to come. There's a collective experience around it with competing interests at play. So you mentioned reform earlier. What does reform look like to you for an EDI approach, and what do you imagine the future to be like?
As I said, so I mean, DEI has been in Canada for a long time. As I said, in our case, it started off with employment equity in the federal sphere. So we've just seen now different forms of it. Accessibility, so better protecting the rights of persons with disabilities, that has also been around based on human rights protections, but accessibility has also grown to become its own sphere. And sometimes it gets packaged as part of DEI and the like. What we're seeing is, particularly in the academic sphere, is adding in this notion of decolonization. And what do decolonized studies look like? And I know that will raise many eyebrows. It already is raising eyebrows, because you go, isn't medicine just medicine? Isn't engineering simply engineering? What exactly would that look like if it was decolonized? And I don't yet have an answer to that. But as I said, with respect to reform, if you reflect on some of the the implementation issues I raised, it's that. What is the theory of change that we're going to use? So are we using DEI, or do we prefer to use decolonization? Do we prefer to use accessibility, universal design, or universal belonging? Whatever that concept may be. What will be its scope? Should it, and DEI also needs to be balanced with academic freedom. So should professors be forced to include, let's say, trigger warnings? Or would we come back to the limits of a professor is lord and master of their classroom? So they teach and instruct however they feel, however they may like. Or is there a balance to be found? So I think there are just more questions to be raised about how we actually go from here. And I definitely don't have all the answers.
You have many of them. Thank you very much, Dave Doyen, for joining us today. And we're going to finish there. So thanks to everyone for your questions. Sorry if we didn't get to all of them. Wonderful presentation. Thanks again, and see you next time.
Yeah. Oh, quick thing. If anyone wants to follow up with me, you can reach out to me via LinkedIn if that's helpful for you. I am happy for us to continue this conversation in one way, shape, or form or the other, because I know many times we don't get access to DEI professionals or professionals who may want to come and engage in this way, but I am happy to anytime.
Wonderful. Thank you. And next, we're going to go to some closing remarks with Dr. Martin Drapeau.
Thank you, Gina. Everyone's very, very tired, so I'm going to keep this short and sweet. Thank you. Thank you to each of our speakers, David Haskell, Eric Smith, Richard Preuss, and Dave Doyen, who we just heard. We've heard, I think, many thought-provoking presentations today. Some we may agree with, some we might not agree with, and that's absolutely fine. We can improve the way we act by fine-tuning what we think, and that can only be done, I think Dave said that very nicely, that can only be done by confronting our ideas to the ideas of other people. What matters is, I think, that we continue the conversation, and that's exactly what we're going to be doing tomorrow. As a reminder, we're going to resume at 10 Eastern Time tomorrow. If you plan on attending online, you can use the exact same Zoom link you used today. If, however, you happen to be in Montreal, you can join us in person at McGill, shake some hands, meet some people, broaden your network. And if you want this, all you need to do is email us at, and I'll put that in the chat right now, info@colloquia.ca. So just let us know that you want to join us tomorrow in person. We have just a few spots left. I'll add your name as soon as I get it. Please do it by maybe 10 or 11 p.m. Eastern Time today. Tomorrow is going to be a conversation between two scholars who have a different point of view on EDI, and our hope is not only to inform our ideas and our beliefs and our positions, but also to model dialogue, to model conversation, and to show that we can still talk to one another even if we have a different point of view. So between now and tomorrow morning, we will be collecting the final slides and the PowerPoints of the presenters. So again, if you would like to have a copy of them, just email us at info@colloquia.ca. And on that note, well, let's wrap things up for today. Let's continue thinking. Let's continue talking to one another, and let's continue working together. Enjoy your afternoon. Enjoy your evening if you're out in the Maritimes. And depending on what time zone you're in, and let's talk some more tomorrow. Thank you so much.